All right, hello everybody, welcome. We'll probably have a few more people joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm Thomas Smith. I'm CEO of Gatto Images and also chair of the DMLA's Education Committee. And I'm really excited to welcome you today to the second webinar in our 2021 Info Plus series. We'll be sharing and discussing hot topics in the industry, breaking news, industry trends, and much more in our webinar series this year. We want to thank our sponsors, Capture, Image Rights, Pick Rights, CDAS, SmartFrame, and of course, Google. And we also want to make you aware of a couple of upcoming webinars that you may be interested in joining. On May 21st, we have a webinar for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We'll be talking about alt text, metadata, and the right ways to generate text that makes your content more accessible and also more searchable and profitable. And we're also going to be holding a webinar likely in June about NFTs and exploring the legal and content and creative and business sides of NFTs, how they relate to our industry, provenance, and a lot of other really exciting topics there. So please stay tuned. You can register for the May 21st webinar already. We'll let you know as soon as possible about the NFTs webinar. Just a reminder, we will be releasing the recording from our first webinar in the series, which looked at industry trends back in March. We'll be releasing that recording shortly. And the recording from today's webinar will go out to members as soon as possible. It's one of the perks of DMLA membership, and then will be shared out to the general public in about a month. So we're really excited to gather with members of our industry and some special guests today. And then know that this recording and this webinar will be shared much more broadly. So our conversation today will benefit a much broader audience. So thank you again for joining us for the Info Plus series. And I'm going to hand it over to Amanda from Adobe to get us started.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on drones, or also known as unmanned aerial vehicles. Drones have emerged as a hot topic as more and more professional photographers and videographers work with them, and the related regulations are evolving. So in today's webinar, we have two experts in the field who will discuss what individual photographers, videographers, and agencies need to know to safely and legally fly drones to capture excellent content. Let's go through a little bit of housekeeping first. As you all know, please mute during the presentation. You can unmute to ask your questions, or you can put questions in the chat pod. I also want to give the important legal disclaimer that the information presented today is for general guidance and is not to address any specific matters. So the application and impact of laws can vary widely based on the specific facts involved and where the acts happen. So as such, the information shared today should not be used as substitution for consultation with your legal counsel. And also the opinions we express are our own personal opinions, not those of our companies or any government entity. As Jody said, as Tom said, I'm Amanda Perrot. I lead the legal team at Adobe, representing Adobe Stock, which is our content licensing business, Behance, as well as our content-related initiatives at Adobe. We've got two amazing panelists here today. I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with John Allen.
Thanks, Amanda. I think it said on the slide I was a founder of Allen Associates Consulting. That's just a title for my retirement job. I just got off, retired from JetBlue as a vice president of safety, also a management pilot. So I was flying up and down the East Coast and interacting with drones over Long Island as we approached into LaGuardia. And then before that, I had 21 years in the Federal Aviation Administration. Last 10 years, I was the Deputy Director of Flight Standards. And then in the last 5, I was the Director of Flight Standards. That may not mean anything to you. So if you will, the FAA had 4 parts back then. The 2 smallest were airports, where they gave grants, and also commercial space in its infancy. The 2 bigger parts of the FAA is, of course, air traffic, which you might be most familiar with, and had the greatest the greatest input in the regulation of drones back in the beginning of the century, 2000 or so. But then the part that I was within was aviation safety. And within aviation safety, you have the smaller part that is concerning themselves with the certification of new aircraft. And they were on the hot seat with the recent 737 MAX we in the Flight Standards Service had the inspectors that go out and really have the responsibility for regulatory oversight, safety oversight for anything that operates within the FAA jurisdiction worldwide. And so during that tenure, when I was in that position, at 5,000 folks within Flight Standards Service, about 3,500 were inspectors, and the drone issue came up. Now, ironically, at that same time, I was also in the Air Force Reserves in the Office of Air Force Acquisition. And so I was sitting in meetings in the Pentagon, and I was watching the explosive growth and technology of drones. And at the same time, sitting in meetings at the FAA, and they weren't even looking at drones. They were looking at very light jets. The term was the very light jets are going to blacken the skies. Well, unfortunately, that was wrong. It was drones that are blackening the skies. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we are or why we are. So that's my background on this issue right now.
Great. It's a long, long history, so it's excellent to have that background for us. And Jody, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Amanda, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I am with the Federal Aviation Administration, and my position, John would have been my boss, as the level he described, like he had, of course, accurately said, in aviation safety and flight standards. But more specifically, I work for a policy and regulatory division in Washington, D.C., and that is AFS 800. And we are the General Aviation and Commercial division in the FAA under what is now called the Office of Safety Standards. And we're responsible for policy and regulations concerning specific areas. Those areas, of course, is why I'm here today, is AFS 800, the division that I work for, is the primary OPR, the primary division that is responsible for all policy and regulations concerning with UAS. Now, you'll hear that term used interchangeably, I think, today. Drones is a accepted term now. I think the FAA fought that for a while, but we tend to use AUS, and the industry uses drones, but they're certainly one and the same. A quick background: like John said, I am still an aviation safety inspector. I spent a few years at a flight standards district office in the field, where inspectors conduct investigations, enforcements, flight checks, and whatnot, anything related to a jurisdictional area based on that field office. I later moved to the Washington, D.C. office, AFS 800, which is the Policy and Regulatory Office. Prior to that, I had 20 years experience as a commercial pilot in the industry, primarily for 135 type air carrier flight operations. So that's my background, and be glad to speak more in depth on anything later on. Thanks a lot, Amanda.
Great, thank you. So John, we thought we'd have you start with kind of the early FAA interactions with drones. So I'll see if I can get Zoom to work to share a screen. There we go. If everybody can see that, I'll turn it over to you, John.
Oh, I like the graphic. Thanks, Amanda. Okay.
Adobe stock. This is not Unsplash, not anybody else.
Good. Yeah, I was looking for my stock of all the drone pictures I used to have. Hi, everybody. As I alluded in my intro, I was in a unique position because of my Air Force Reserve responsibilities at the Pentagon in the Air Force acquisition, and watched the explosive growth of the drones. As Jody said, we called them UAS because they were a system. It was considered not only the aircraft, but the people on the ground who are operating them and things like that. It was a lot of interest back then, but not a lot of knowledge. And as I said, the FAA at first was looking at other things, and looking back retrospectively, the FAA seemed to get their lead on new technologies and doing regulatory action from the large, or not even large or small, aircraft manufacturers. So the drone or UAS, UAV issue hit them from left field, blindsided, because they weren't looking there. So therefore, we're still, I remember, 10 years behind on the regulatory um, framework needed for drones. Now, you might say, well, what's so big a deal about it? I mean, just put them up there. They're not going to hurt anything. They're small. They're out of the way. You would be surprised at how many things are up in the airspace. And actually today, how many near misses there are, and sometimes non-near misses of commercial aircraft with drones. Now, primarily, these are recreational type folks who are operating them. But when this came to be, and the Congress finally demanded action about 2007, and Jody can correct me about it, I was trying to go back in my memory to say, hey, industry is really taking note of all the capabilities. And why do they have the capabilities? Because they've got the cell phone technology. In the 90s, this stuff miniaturized the computing power for gyro stabilization, for cameras, for all kinds of things, making drones now lightweight, where they had great capability. And when the military started putting harm missiles on them and actually firing at our targets, they proved how effective they are. When we started getting briefings early on with folks coming in, the limitation of what drones can do for our society is limited by the imagination. It's amazing the number of things they can do. However, how do you integrate them into an already crowded national aviation system? And that's the problem at hand. Now, back in the early 2000s, I had personal frustration because air traffic was given the responsibility for the oversight and the guidance on how drones could be operated, and approvals, because they were approved on system by system. And unfortunately, air traffic had the mindset, well, let's not facilitate it, let's just restrict it so it does no harm to our NAS. And that seemed to put a thumb on the industry for several years, until finally demand overrode that notion. And the Office for Oversight of the Drones, or UASs, in about 2000 went to a higher level. I know back in, I think it was like 2010, I flew then Administrator Randy Babbitt out to Creech Air Force Base so he could watch the UAS operations there at Creech, and was amazed at the war fighters there actually manipulating drones that were flying over Afghanistan and performing special ops, and started getting a pretty good idea. But it seemed to be getting out of control. We started getting complaints from the community of Beverly Hills, because some folks you may know were operating drones, and there was a huge concern expressed in terms of privacy. And therefore, without any regulatory restrictions, people were operating drones. So it got to be out of control because local communities were putting up zoning ordinances and ordinances, and the FAA didn't have any good language certifying the requirements for those operating them. So those operating them didn't know about airport areas or how the NAS is in terms of altitudes. And so some basic requirements were put in place, and the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, I think, the landmark, where it gave a lot more, required more specificity. And of course, the FAA, with their offices, had to really work hard to put together a database so that they could keep track of those operating drones, and to make sure that the best they can, those operating had all the information they needed so they didn't operate them in an unsafe manner, and also put some requirements around the drones so that they're not too big, they're small. And to make it clear to those operating that they really needed to stay below 400 feet and not operate higher than 100 miles per hour, and also stay out of airport areas, and giving those folks operating the drones the resources, the knowledge as to where they are, so that it didn't impinge upon the people flying. biggest concern was the police helicopters who do fly at a very low altitude, and they still are flying down in that area of 400 feet below. But we were also really concerned about the commercial aircraft, and there were studies done about the impact a drone could have, and have done tests, the military did, and the impact level, and it's enough to take out an engine of a commercial airliner, and it could be significant damage. So this is still being worked in terms of giving some regulatory structure around this thing so that those who are operating have the knowledge, have the capability and the certification to do so safely. And then we can keep moving forward in terms of integrating the drone operations a little more freely in the airspace. But a lot more work has to be done. And one thing, just me personally, I thought would be a good thing is update, and I think Jody's going to talk to this. I apologize, Jody, I already forgot the moniker, but and up to this point, it was basically a premise that aircraft avoid each other by seeing each other. Well, with speed and things like that, that's not really realistic, and that most aircraft have an electronic signature, but not everything up in the air does. Parachutists, balloonists, you name it. And so I've been an advocate that everything should have electronic signatures so that we put the responsibility on the drone architecture to avoid based on the electronic signatures they pick up. So that's just one idea for the future as we go forward. So I thought I'd give a little bit of backdrop that you might think we're from a government perspective, we're really sophisticated and can accept the drones into the system. And it's just not the case because we were put in the hole early on. It caught the FAA by surprise, and a lot of activity is happening. And I would argue that a lot of those wanting to operate the drones have a lot more money than does the FAA. So it's Jody and the group he works with have their hands full. It's very, very challenging. So that is a lead in, Jody. I think that's enough for me for now.
That is a great segue for Jody to kind of bring us up from 2018 and also, key points from his history as well, because there have been some recent changes, which would be great to hear from you, Jody, on those.
Yeah, certainly, Amanda, and thank you, John. And I'm sure I'll ask you to jump back in here, John, at some point also. To give you some background basics of UAS, and like John said, UAS is considered not only the unmanned aircraft, but the system itself. And that system, we think of it as maybe 3 parts. So the aircraft itself, and then what would be called the control link or the C2 link, the command and control link in between that aircraft, and then what's called a ground control station, where that UA would be actually controlled from. So that's what makes up the UAS. Anyway, going back as a kind of a higher level overview of where we're at, like John said,
Просто идешь на down, up,
somebody may have to mute, please.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you.
So starting with the 2012 reauthorization, which started the mandate of the FAA having to mandate UAS into the NAS, and then going to the 2018 reauthorization bill that contained a lot of sections that were connected to UAS operation. Like John said, it's been a huge challenge. And we were talking about this, I think, a week or so ago, too, that the integration of UAS into what we call the NAS, the National Airspace System, is one of the most challenging things the FAA has undertaken. And I believe it's even bigger than the jet age from the 60s, when the transition was basically made from propeller-driven aircraft to jet engine aircraft. And now here we are. We're kind of, and I agree with John that we're behind the power curve, so to speak. That's a aviation term, but we're holding the tail of the tiger. We're not holding the leash of the tiger and directing the tiger around. We're just trying to hang on right now. But there's some very good, complicated reasons for that. So coming off of these reauthorizations, Congress mandates FAA now will integrate these UAS into the National Airspace System. And what we're mostly talking about here is commercial type operations, right? So UAS in themselves have been around for a long, long time. Let's say they're more so known as recreational flyers or radio controlled airplanes back in the day. But the real integration that Congress was concerned with and what the FAA has to deal with mostly is how to integrate commercial operations into the NAS. And the first step that the FAA took was issuing what was called Section 333 exemptions. And we issued exemptions for commercial operations into the National Airspace System. And this was the precursor to a regulation that the FAA developed and we have in place today, which is a starting point, but not nearly what we need. And that is, hopefully you're familiar with. So it's 14 CFR Part 107. Part 107 is the first FAA regulation that we have developed to deal directly with the UAS operating in the National Airspace System. Now, this Part 107, which it became active in, I think, June of 2016, is primarily what we call a visual line of sight, a VLOS operation, meaning the remote pilot in command, which is what that terminology is used for a pilot controlling a UAS, must have that UA in sight, in line of sight at all times while they're flying it. And to further enhance on that, operations typically come in these two styles of visual line of sight and what we call beyond visual line of sight, or BVLOS operations. Beyond visual line of sight operations, of course, is where the UA is operated beyond where the remote pilot and certificate can see it. Typically, it could be for long distances, just like manned aircraft fly. The two largest challenges that the FAA faces, and this is my opinion, but it's also my experience working, is what we would call the certification, right, of the UAS itself. So whether you realize it or not, but every aircraft, or virtually almost every aircraft that flies in the skies has gone through a very rigorous type certification process. And that type certification process has determined that that aircraft is reliable to a safety standard that the public has grown to know and accept, that that aircraft just will not fall out of the sky and it's safe to fly over top of our heads. And that is one area where the FAA has fell behind, is providing certification for unmanned aircraft systems. And that has become a real challenge because we're trying to do this and set this up and at the same time allow commercial operations to occur in the National Airspace System with safety standards, some level of safety standards involved. Now, like John said, there's lots of aircraft flying in the skies, more than you know, manned and unmanned. And flying an aircraft in the National Airspace System, whether it's manned or unmanned, has two major concerns, and one what we call air risk, and the other is the ground risk. So there's a risk when an aircraft is in the air to other aircraft that are utilizing that same airspace system, but there's also the ground risk portion, which is the aircraft, for whatever reason, does not fall out of the sky and hit a person, hits a structure, or and injure somebody. And although that still happens with certification aircraft, there was a misfortunate accident, I think last week, where an aircraft hit a private residence and there was a couple people killed. So, but it is trying to obtain that level of safety that the public has grown to know from the United States and us controlling and running, the safest airspace system in the world. So I could stop there. And I mean, there's tons more I can speak to. I would stop there if John or Amanda want to add something or redirect the conversation for a little bit. Over.
Yeah, I think, you highlighted on the air risk and ground risk, but I've also believe that the regulations have opened up a little bit with allowing drones to fly at night recently. So what was the thought behind kind of opening that up a little bit, is to recognize the need for people like our members, commercial photographers and videographers, to have more ability to capture content, but to do it in a safe way?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good and fair question, Amanda. And yes, that has happened. Like I said, the Part 107 rule was put together and became effective in 2016. And it just was recently, very recently, April 21st, that rule was amended and is now effective. And it contains two very important pieces. And again, let's keep in the context that the Part 107 rule is a visual line of sight rule only. And it's also a rule for what we have termed as small UAS. And small UAS in our definition is a UAS and everything on board at takeoff weighs less than 55 pounds. And those aircraft that operate under Part 107 do not need an airworthiness certificate like the manned aircraft do, or possibly for larger UAS aircraft that will be developed. So that amendment that Amanda was referring to, which just very recently happened, had to do with allowing for operations over people, because Part 107 previously restricted those operations where you could not visually line of sight fly your UA over top of people who were not participating in the operation itself, meaning over yourself or a visual observer that you were utilizing to help you keep track of the UA. That in itself is a very good point to make also, is that under Part 107, with these aircraft that weigh less than 55 pounds, they have been heavily utilized by commercial operations who have cameras on them, utilized, of course, for real estate is the biggest one, area data collection in agricultural operations, infrastructure inspection, meaning to go look at a power line or a gas line, things like that. So the use of a camera mounted on a UAS has produced large and very valuable options, given that you could more safely at times and certainly more economically feasible at times, rather than use the manned aircraft to accomplish missions such as taking pictures and inspecting infrastructure, so on and so forth.
And with those expansions of the ability to fly over people at fly night, there are still requirements. So if you and John wouldn't mind touching on those requirements, just to refresh for our interested audience who uses unmanned unmanned aerial vehicles. I go for drones, but now after Fiend's presentation, I'll make sure I say either UAS or unmanned area vehicles. But if you could kind of touch on, remind our audience of those requirements. So there's expansion, but there's still things they have to follow given the safety concerns.
Right. So Part 107 is still a visual line of sight operation. It is primarily issued for below 400 feet above ground level and below. Because this first step, like John said, we were mandated for integration, but the first step, really, the FAA used segregation. In other words, we were keeping the small UAS out of the way of the manned aircraft by limiting their altitude to 400 feet AGL. Now, again, the original rule said no operations over people. That is still that is
George.
still
Sorry,
true and valuable. However, what
Sorry,
happens
somebody will
is
need to mute. Somebody can please mute. Thank you. Sorry, Jody. Make sure we can all hear you.
So what happens is the amended rule now allows for operations over people with exceptions to meeting certain criteria in categories. So there's a category 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each of those categories requires the UA and the operation to meet certain criteria. And if you can meet that criteria, then you can engage in operations over people to an extent that the rule allows. But it's a stepping stone towards where the industry wants to go, right? So if we look back in a short period of history, a couple of years ago, most operations were very content with visual line of sight. We fast forward to today, where there's a large percentage of proposed operations now are beyond visual line of sight. So those challenges in approving, the FAA approving those types of operations increases dramatically without a rule structure to contain them. And the way we've been able to deal with it so far, not as efficiently as we like it and industry likes it, though, has been through what we call issuing waivers and issuing exemptions to those rule parts to allow for proposed more complex operations. And those types of things can involve operations at nighttime, operations of multiples, right? Instead of flying 1 UA, you fly 5 UA, and operations beyond the visual line of sight. And so there's all kinds of challenges that come into that, because one of the things that we do take for granted with manned aircraft is a pilot has a responsibility of seeing and avoiding. And when you take that same responsibility and you transpose it to a UAS operation, that is a heavy, heavy technological ask now. And that's something that has not yet quite been solved. There is lots of industry partners working on that see and avoid, what we term now in the UAS industry and parlance is DAA, which is detect and avoid. So it would be some kind of technological system on the UA that could detect other aircraft and be able to avoid other aircraft, just like a manned pilot can do in a manned aircraft operation.
Great, thank you. I wanted to circle back to something, John, you said, where you highlighted in the history that privacy issues with UAVs became problematic. And I'm hoping both of you can touch on, how much of a focus privacy is with related to drones. It's something that just in general in the content industry, there's the right of privacy, making sure you have model releases and proper releases for content. But I see with UAVs the potential for even more privacy exposure there. So if you could talk about that, I know that'd be very interesting for our audience.
Yeah, I'll start, and Jody can probably give more context. But back in mid-2000s, when UAVs were already showing great capability and snapping pictures, and we're doing so with a lot of folks in Beverly Hills who have a lot of power. And so therefore, we were getting a lot of cards and letters from folks that we didn't know, but we had to address the issue. And I believe in the language of, I don't know if it's part 107 or I've seen it someplace, there are restrictions from the distance you can operate from buildings and things like that. And when I was working on the committee for drones, and we were working with a lot of local and state government jurisdictions who I believe are looking to be fairly aggressive in, if they're not already, creating zoning requirements or operating requirements or restrictions depending on their community, so that one who's operating a drone would not only have to be aware of the FAA requirements for operating safely in the national airspace system to avoid other aircraft, but they would probably also need to be aware of local ordinances and restrictions of operating because of a privacy or also safety or even security issue. That's one thing forgotten by folks, is there is an actual concern out there that the terrorists, folks who want to do harm, could use drones very easily. And so that has to be taken into consideration as well. So Jody can speak to specifics, I believe, on that in terms of restrictions from buildings and things like that. But philosophically, we were working with communities to institute their own restrictions.
Yeah, I will follow on that, John, and certainly that has become a very big and complicated challenge because just the nuance between UAS and manned aircraft, we never really had to consider this type of afore, and it's kind of a quagmire, and the FAA does try to steer away from the privacy issues as much because unfortunately or fortunately, your backyard, if you jump up in the air, you're in the national airspace system. And previously with manned aircraft, we didn't have to worry about that because we have laws and limits for aircraft of how close they can fly to the ground and where they can. But those type of operations, when you transfix those to a UAS, and especially under Part 107, where the altitude limit is 400 feet, but there is no minimum limit. Now you can, so is it legal to fly in your neighbor's backyard? Well, it may or may not be, depending on what you're doing. But as far as the FAA is concerned, the National Airspace System is the National Airspace System, and we don't get involved in that type of regulation at that level. As far as where privacy and stuff goes, it would just be a safety factor based on meeting the sections of the rule. One of the things I did want to touch on that I probably missed is that Part 107 requirement is like I said, is a commercial operations, which requires two basic things. So it requires the certification of the pilot, which is a small, what we would refer to as a remote pilot certificate. So the pilot has to be certificated, and the drone or the UAS has to be registered, right? And so those two things have to occur. Now, I did see a question posted where commercial operations versus recreational operations. And now we are requiring recreational aircraft to be registered, but there are no certification requirements for recreational pilots. However, there will be, soon coming is a knowledge course that we want recreational pilots to take, so they have a knowledge of the National Airspace System so they can operate safely in such. So that's a difference there.
And so, Jody, just for this audience here, so if they want to fly a drone to take photos or capture videos and give it to a company, license it to a company like Adobe or Getty Images or Shutterstock for sale, they will need to get past the pilot's test and register their drone. Just want to make sure our audience hears that. Yep.
That is correct. And then operate accordingly under that rule part.
And how difficult is the certification test? I did read online that it could be quite challenging. Maybe not for you and John, because you have flown a bunch of different aircraft, but what kind of topics are covered, if you have any insight there?
Yeah, so I'll start and John can add if he sees fit. But the main difference between pilot certification under Part 107 for UAS and any other manned aircraft, which all pilot certification in manned aircraft occurs under Part 61, is where a certification for a remote pilot certificate is a written test only. There is no practical test to that. And a practical test is a terminology that we use in the FAA that has to do with the actual flight test and an oral test. So you have an examiner that now this is for manned aircraft for receiving a pilot certification under Part 61. You would be required to take a written test and pass that. And then you would have a practical test where you would actually have to go up and fly the aircraft. And you would also have to answer questions orally from the examiner. So that is a written and a practical test, the practical made up of an oral test and a flight test, where Part 107 for UAS operations, there is no practical test side of that. It is just a written test right now.
Okay. And then the newer requirement is this remote ID. And I don't know if that's come into effect yet. Is that something that's going to be phased in, if I'm remembering correctly?
Yes, you're correct. So legally, it became rule or law, but it's not effective it's about 3 years yet. So there's a very long effectivity point in that. And that was born out of the safety partners, so to speak, and I think air traffic as well, where remote ID was being able to somehow track and find out who is actually flying. And it's not that the federal government or Big Brother wants to know who's flying. It comes from a safety standpoint and a security standpoint of who can fly a drone, because like John mentioned, bad actors could very easily use a drone remotely located, piloted, and it would be very hard, and sometimes it still is very hard, is to find out who that drone belongs to and who's actually controlling it.
Got it. And my understanding as well is just, thinking for our audience that, when you're flying your drone, I believe you have to have your certificate and your remote ID with you, and any law enforcement operator can ask to see it. So I want to make sure people have the proper documentation when they're flying their drones.
Amanda, if I could interject, I'm sorry,
please.
Jody. Yeah, that's important. You bring up a good point with law enforcement, because when a commercial flight is flying and they have a system on their airplane, it's a traffic avoidance system, a traffic conflict avoidance system, and they get a signature and they might pick up a drone or see it. What they do is they immediately hit their, I don't want to get too technical, but they hit a button that can give a signal to air traffic saying, hey, we just saw a drone or UAV, it just came off our right wing. And then the air traffic will notify local law enforcement and give local law enforcement the coordinates as to where that sighting was. So then local law enforcement will be the ones who will be trying to find the perpetrators. And a lot of times they find them. And same with lasers. I have the same issue with there as well. So yeah, it's important. It will be local law enforcement that would come knocking.
That is a very important point for our audience. Anything to add to that, Jody, about how important it is to have the documentation with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very similar, of course, what we require to manned aircraft pilots now. It is a form of identification, and it's a way the regulator can enforce or bring an enforcement against a pilot if an incursion occurs. But certainly that is very important. And just to tag on to that is in the 2018 reauthorization, there was a section called 363, which Congress basically prohibited a dangerous weapon to be carried on a UAS. And right now, the FAA is undertaking a rulemaking project to deal with just that. So it is right now by statute, it is illegal for anyone to put a dangerous weapon on a UAS. Got it.
Which our audience should not be doing, just cameras and video cameras, I certainly hope. We have two questions from our audience, one which I think was already answered. Somebody was asking about the acronym of NAS, which I think is National Airspace System, if I was listening correctly, Jody, okay. And the second question is to both of you, what would you say the top 3 things to do or consider are before starting to fly drones for business purposes? I know I've kind of touched on it in various points, but if we could wrap that up into kind of the three main things.
Can I start? Then Jody can give the color commentary. I'd say knowledge is number one. And even the term NAS, I mean, I'm not sure our audience fully appreciates how complex the aerial roadway system is, especially in the United States. Let's say that you live east of Los Angeles International. You have airplanes coming every couple minutes, letting down over Phoenix, Arizona to land at LAX. And they don't get below 400 feet till they get close to the airport. That's why it's important for operators of UAS drones to know what the restrictions are for operating drones outside of a airport operational area. And it depends whether it's a huge airport or it's a small airport that has less activity, but it's important that folks understand that. And to understand that besides airline aircraft, passenger carrying aircraft, like I said, you have a lot of other utility type aircraft, whether it be the police or it might be even news reporters. And they're operating very, very low and come close even to within 400 feet or below. So there might be restrictions. So again, knowledge is important for the operator to understand the implication of them operating this piece of equipment. You know, our regulation, the 107, really borrows heavily from the previous, as Jody mentioned, the radio controlled airplanes. And back in the day, we had several large radio controlled airplanes. They had big 4 engines on them, and they would go out and they would go outside the radio range. They were uncontrolled and they would crash into a house. So we started with that experience. And therefore, as we grow these regulations, it's done so based on data that tells us it's safe to do certain things, whether it's to operate over the horizon, outside line of sight at night, things like that. These extra things will happen, but it has to be based on data to grow it intelligently, so we don't do harm, because the FAA is levied with the responsibility to assure safety, and the operators, those out there operating drones, are required to ensure safety. Big difference there. And so I would say, you know, knowledge is the most important thing. And then just evaluating their environment, evaluating risk. What's the wind doing? Is it going to run? The wind going to push the UAS into a building? Even though they're stabilized pretty well, I've seen some exceed and hit the building. So exercising risk. And lastly, kind of tied to the knowledge, is not just FAA regulations, which is dealing with aviation safety, but there are local community restrictions that are probably come into play as well. That'd be just my point.
Yeah, I'll piggyback up on John, because, and I'm glad he started with knowledge, because honestly, that is the largest, most important thing I think that we can convey to this young, increasing industry is knowledge, because that the FAA is faced with probably the largest challenge is somehow educating the industry where you can literally look at something and say, hey, you know what? I can go out and buy a drone for a couple $100 or $1,000, and I can you put a camera on it and I can use it in a business, and it may be a very useful tool in that business, but yet that operator who may or probably does not have any aeronautical knowledge or experience previous to that can literally go register and take a test and get a remote pilot certificate in a very short period of time with a very small investment. And what we're faced with is educating this new group of people that are pilots and operating in the national airspace system, and teaching them the large responsibility on how to operate safely in the NAS and how to operate in conjunction with other aircraft, and like John pointed out, to be knowledgeable about airspace. So where you're flying is safe, so you're not causing turmoil or endangering manned aircraft operations near airports and such, because it is vitally important to know that. And that has been the biggest challenge, is how do we educate a large group of people that have basically no aviation background and experience. The magnitude of this is something. You know, I was thinking the other day, from manned aircraft, from the Wright brothers till now, we're talking about, like, we have probably like 300 and some thousand aircraft registered in the United States. And I just checked right now, there's probably between 1.7 and 2 million UAS registered in the United States now. And so we're talking about 300,000 aircraft that are registered over a 100-year period versus 2 million or close to 2 million just in the last couple of years. I mean, the magnitude is just phenomenal, and that certainly is part of the challenge that the FAA is having to deal with. But definitely knowledge and education is the best way. So to be more to the point, is certainly not just go out and take the test and pass it, but there are, you know, the internet now provides numerous ways that you can gain that information. But the FAA does too. You go to FAA.gov and you can get links to documents to the public. There's something that we put out, it's called advisory circulars, or ACs, and it's kind of like plain language pamphlets and documents that tell you the ins and outs of how to operate under certain rule parts or certain types of operations. Advisory circulars are very, very important, and a very easy, no-cost way on how to educate yourself and go about things. And one other thing that you can do is you go to FAA.gov and you can get a UAS hotline or helpline, and you can dial questions and speak to people that will be able to answer you, point to you, provide you with links to provide that information for you. So education and knowledge is the basis here for sure.
And what's the penalty to make sure there's some teeth behind this? So what are, if you have an idea of the kind of fines or criminal, what are the penalties for noncompliance?
Well, John could speak to this as well, but you know, one of the reasons that we require, the FAA requires any pilot to have a certificate, is because you need something to have a penalty against, right? So if a pilot does not hold a pilot certificate, you can't take an enforcement action against them from the regulator standpoint. I guess you could go civil, but so probably the largest penalty would be either to suspend or revoke someone's certificate so they couldn't operate anymore. There are some infractions that deal with monetary values, but a couple of years ago, the FAA took a new approach to enforcements and compliancy. So where we're trying to incorporate, instead of immediately bringing in legal enforcement action against a pilot who makes a mistake, we try to have them through compliancy and education, right, to teach them and educate them so they don't make that mistake again. So typically that is the first step of what happens in a enforcement action, is trying to apply that education portion to it, rather than just taking an enforcement action that would involve a monetary penalty fee or suspending someone's license for a period of time.
I'll pop in here too. There might be some local infractions, like getting a speeding ticket. Remember, the police will be showing up. If someone routinely does it and they find out who's doing something inappropriate, there might be some local ordinance or some local requirements that they can institute some type of fine, as you would with a speeding ticket. I believe that was discussed, and that's outside the federal realm. So that's why I say knowledge is important, not just of federal regulation, but also local requirements.
Yeah, that is an excellent point that we do have you two speaking on the federal rules, but almost every state has a law or has one in the works relating to UAVs. There's also, again, local laws. So, yep, circling back on knowledge. One last question, which is in the chat. I'm not sure who it's directed to, probably both of you. Is there a desire or need by the FAA to apply type certification to Part 107 drones? Or will it be more of a data gathering exercise and then make a decision, or not at all?
Okay, so the amendment to Part 107, which just became effective on 4/21, does contain a, like I said, for operations over people, a method and way to do so through a categorical approach. So category 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Category 4 deals with type certification. So that what that means is if you have a category 4 small UAS that operates under Part 107, you will be able to fly over top of people under these certain restrictions that are contained into the rule. Now, certification of a UAS is just like a manned aircraft, is a very long and labor-intensive process. And it's not, it can be a fairly expensive process, but typically certification of aircraft are most always taken on by the manufacturer, not necessarily the operator, right? So you would buy a certificated aircraft, or you would buy, right now you're buying a uncertificated UAS aircraft, but eventually there will be certificated UAS aircraft on the market to be bought.
Only thing I'd throw in there too is that I know back in the early 2000s, we were also dealing with huge UASs, Global Hawk that the military is operating for surveillance purposes, and then the Predator, which you all heard on the news, which is armed with HARM missiles and things like that, but they're very large. I think the Global Hawk is pretty close to the size of a 737. And so those are I think, if Jody, I'm not mistaken, handled under different regulations because they operate in a whole different air realm. They're not small, and the whole different realm of the NAS, very, very high. And so there's completely different regulations and requirements for them.
Right. Well, we will have to. Oh, please go ahead, Jody.
That is correct.
Excellent. Well, we are at time. I know Tom wanted to say something about our upcoming one, but I want to say a huge thank you to Jody and John. This has been wonderful for our membership to hear from two experts with a long history there. And I think really, again, to stress what you did, knowledge, checking the rules, checking the FAA websites, checking your local regulations and state, because this is an area where there's a lot of attention and it's evolving. It's also something, that as a contributor to content agencies, they're looking at this as well, and it's something that's going to continue to be a focus in the upcoming years. I'll turn it over to Tom.
Amanda for moderating. Thank you for the panelists. This was such a great conversation. I just wanted to jump in because we had a lot of participants join us a little bit later in the presentation, which is great to have so many people here. I'm Thomas Smith. I'm CEO of Gatto Images and also the chair of the DMLA's Education Committee. And I just wanted to make people aware of some upcoming webinars if you enjoy what you saw today. We have another webinar on May 21st for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We'll be talking about best practices for alt text to make your images more accessible and also more findable via SEO and more profitable, so don't miss that. Registration is open for that, and it's free, as all these webinars are, to DMLA members. We're also going to be holding an NFT webinar in June. The date hasn't been determined, but we'll be talking about all of the legal and technical and business aspects of NFTs. We just want to quickly thank our sponsors, Capture, Image Rights, Pick Rights, CDAS, SmartFrame, and Google for sponsoring the DMLA in this series. And just a reminder that the recordings of these webinars are shared to members immediately, as soon as possible after the event, and then will be public about a month after. So all of the great discussion that you all have facilitated today will obviously, it was a wonderful discussion to have here, but that will then feed into a much broader audience. So thank you for enriching our discussion today, for asking great questions that I think will benefit both people within our industry and far beyond. So thank you again so much for attending today. And thank you again to the panelists and to Amanda for moderating.